Alright, so we finished preparation on the template stock, which is the stock up here on the top, and then you can tell quite a few modifications were made in reference to the bottom stock, which is the actual original stock. One of the things you'll also notice, first of all, is the trigger guard. This is the original trigger guard that was for this particular gun, and I'm just going to set this right here. This trigger guard, you'll notice, is not going to fit here because of the modifications I made to the grip. And so what I'll do there is I'll come back and I'll make a sand casting, and that'll be a video later on using a sand casting technique to refabricate this trigger guard to the dimensions that I need. You'll also notice here on this particular stock, if I can get this turned up correctly here, I also raised these edges up, and all that's going to do, in other words, the edges here that I made on this particular gun. You'll notice here it's a little bit hard to tell on this particular picture, but you'll notice here how I raised these edges up using the Bondo. All that's doing is it's giving me a little bit of a wiggle room when I'm cutting this out. I don't the final inletting, trimming the inletting and down to the receiver using a chisel and sandpaper to get that down to the dimensions that I want. But all I did, I just wanted to point out what I did was I just raised that up a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about now then our final piece of wood here that I'm working with. This is a piece of exhibition clear walnut that I got from Calico Woods, hardwoods. I've for now about 7-8 years, and I always get a great piece of wood. You'll notice here also that this is a rifle blank. I prefer rifle blanks, my own personal preference. As you go through, you'll have your own preferences, but I prefer rifle blanks. And the primary reason is because the buttstock and the forearm will be the same hue and tone. There's a rare occasion or so I have gotten a buttstock and then they send you the forearm that's a good match, but on rare occasions I have gotten the forearm to where, since it came out of a different piece of wood, the tone of the wood didn't match. As far as the grain, I'm really not concerned about the grain being up here being anything fancy. The forearms are usually heavily checkered anyway. It's really more the buttstock. So let's focus here on the buttstock just a little bit, and I'll flip this around. So most folks, when they're doing these, you'll notice that the grain here is running down, and this would be the toe, if you will. Most of the guns that you'll see, a lot of them, this is also a personal preference, that the grain of the wood is going to be running down towards the toe. Now if you look really closely here, if I lay this and I start doing my layout here, if I start doing the layout here, the grain's actually kind of running this way. It's running this way, and then it curves this way. When I do my layout this way, now then what's happening is the grain is going to be running up towards the top of the stock. And when I do my layout this way now, you'll notice then that the grain's actually following down into the grip. And that's going to give you the most strength. You're not changing the direction of this grain, which actually can weaken the grip area, and it could potentially split. Now anytime you're cutting, there's always that chance, right? Anytime you cut a piece of wood, there's always a chance that when you shoot it, it can split on you. And so what I'm doing, I'm not being the the wood whisperer here or anything like that, but what I'm doing is just a gut instinct. I'm not as concerned with the grain running down into the toe as I want the grain and the layout of this piece of wood for this particular stock, I want the grain to be the strongest that it can be. So I'm going to stay with more of a natural, sort of what the wood's telling me it wants to do. The grain's running straight and then it actually curves down, and I'm going to stay with that flow for this piece of wood. $700-800 on a piece of wood, you can take all the chances that you want to take with it. So that's what's going on here. Alright, so from here what we'll do is we're going to get our horizontal line, we're going to square off the edges, dimple the blank, and then we're prepping this template stock then. We're prepping this for our cut. So most of the blanks actually come in a variety of different dimensions. So I'm just going to give you some rough estimates here. The key thing you want to think of first is you want to get your template stock created so that you generally have an idea of your dimensions that you're going to be working with. So I'm going to give you some minimums that you want to work with. On your buttstock end down here, you want about 7 inches, 8 inches, 7.5. You go over 7 inches, 7.25, 7.5. It gets better. You'll notice I'm going to try to come over top of this as best I can. I should kind of get this laid out. You'll notice now when I come over top of this, change my position here just a little bit. You'll notice how tight. That's pretty tight. To make sure that you get your grip the way you don't have to sacrifice on your template with regards to some of your dimensions when you're transferring them over to your final piece of wood. And so all I'm trying to say here is to just watch the dimensions of the wood that you buy. Watch the thickness. The other one here you'll notice, if I flip this upside down, remember I have this turned at about 18 degrees. And you'll see how the toe here is turned out. Well, what that means, what that means then is on the thickness of your blank, this blank is 2.5 inches thick. So for me, when I make my trap stocks, because I know I'm going to have about an 18-degree toe out, I need a minimum of 2.5 inches. I don't like getting too much more than that. You go 2 3/4, 3 inches, that's more time on the cutter. All right, so 2.5 inches. If you've got a toe coming out, you need at least 2.5 inches. Otherwise, you're not going to get the dimensions. You're not going to be able to transfer the template dimensions over to your blank that you're going to be working with. And I'll also, when I get my horizontal line set up, I'll also probably have to move it down about 1/16 of an inch or so, just to make sure that I've got a little bit more room to handle this. So 7.5 inches going this way, 2.5 inches this way, and then what you're going to do is on your dimensions coming this way, you're just going to need to just monitor any grip modifications and how that's going to impact. This piece of wood is going to work just fine. Like I said, it's pretty tight fit, but we'll get her done. And so those are, can't really think of anything else with regards to the dimensions. Because it's a rifle blank, you're going to have plenty of room. In fact, you'll have excess wood here for your forearm. On this particular template, I did not put a palm swell in here. I could have put a palm swell. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Again, this is personal preference on this particular gun. When I did these dimensions, the way it fit for me was just fine. And then the other thing I happen to like a rollover stock. I don't know, maybe it's personal preference. Stock, if I have the comb coming up, sort of a traditional comb, what happens is it bumps my face. It catches right underneath my cheekbone, and it has a tendency to bump my face more. So again, these are things that I've done with the rollover to try to reducing the perception of the recoil. In an earlier video, I was talking about the drop at comb. On this particular gun, I have this 1/16 of an inch. This front comb is 1/16 of an inch lower than the back of the comb. For this one, I think that's going to be fine. And then you can kind of see here as well, you'll notice as it comes in to the front, it's much more narrower than the back. Not a lot, but it is narrower. And again, that's going to help with perceived recoil. I've also left this a little high too. I've also left this about 1/16 of an inch high, because when I'm finished, I'm going to sand this down to fit. I'd rather sand it down, so I'll sand this down and then I'll take it out to the pattern board to fit. And then last, you'll notice here I've extended this piece of wood, so my piece that I'm actually cutting is coming right through here. All this does is gives me a little extra to work with when I'm cutting this out. And then I'll get my pitch, which is going to come almost right about there down to right about there. I'll cut this pitch out as be one of the last things that I do. All right, so laid out here, I've gone ahead just like we did with the template stock. I've made a holder for the front of this, and then I've also dimpled the front. And then I've also dimpled this. Now I just turned that on my lathe and dimpled that with my end post to get the center of that. This was the hole here was the original hole that went through this extra piece that I've added on to give me a little bit of length this way, and then I just plugged that in and then centered it so that I'm still working off the same axis that I did when I created this template stock. I'm still working off the same axis. So step one, just like we did with the template stock, is you're going to get your horizontal line, and I just line this up, mark it off on the front and the back. Next thing you're going to do is you're just simply going to join the lines. Next, what we're going to do is you want to square this off, and you're squaring this off so that while it's in your so that the blank sits square in the duplicator, just like I did with the template stock. So that's what I'm going to do now, and we'll go ahead and then finish that. Alright, so now we've trimmed our blank down to the dimensions that we're going to be working with. And what we'll need to do now then is, because of I've got 18 degrees on this toe, I'll need to identify it will not be exactly dead center. I'll come down just a little bit because the stock's going to tilt up, and I want to make sure, and I've done a bunch of these, so 2.5 inches works for me. So let me talk just a little bit about this being an Ithaca 4E. An Ithaca 4E does not have a through bolt. So on this particular gun it didn't matter. This one attaches to the buttstock using these two top tangs. Had this been a through bolt, just a tip here, very, very important, this horizontal line that you're setting here, very important. This horizontal line that you're setting here is going to give you the alignment to where your through bolt stops. I usually do 7/8 and then I do 23/64 to finish on through to the receiver. You make modifications in here. If you run this too deep, the Model 32 for example, they have roughly I forgot what it is, it's not a 23/64, but their through hole comes all the way in to right about here, and then they have their bolt going through, and that's fine. Because what they did was they did not make any modifications to the grip area. When I was doing these early on, just a tip here as we go through, you always want to measure where that is in relation to where you're going to be doing any modifications to the grip. And so what I do is I make sure that when I have my alignment, if I have a through hole here where that sticks out, say this would be the end of your rear mount, your rear mount will be perfectly aligned to that same spot, so that your through hole, if your through hole is here, it aligns up here on your good piece of wood. The reason is because if these two are not aligned, and actually the front measurement doesn't really matter, it's just the rear measurement in relation to where your through hole, the 7/8 stops, and then the smaller diameter for the through bolt goes through. The reason is because if you run this in too deep on your 7/8, if you come in too deep here and you start making modifications to this, I'm telling you now, you'll find out when you start cutting it out on your duplicator. And I will tell you from personal experience, it's really not a very happy thing. On that particular piece of wood, it was only $300, but it did sting just a little bit. At that point, then it's pretty much trash. I ended up coming back using a plug, ran it through to extend back into this, and then I was able to sand this out. Beretta 391 has a real issue with that. They have a really large, I forgot the diameter it comes in. This part of the stock on the top area, particularly right about there on the 391, that gets very thin. And so when you start making modifications to your grip, that's just another gun that you want to watch. So those two, the Model 32, probably won't be working too many with those. Not very many of those around. You ought to see the trigger on those guys. It's like a watch. On the Beretta 390, 400s, they get real thin right up in here. So when you start making modifications, be careful about that. Sometimes you're just going to have to make a compromise with what you can do with the gun. I mean, on this blank here, we're pretty much done. I'll make my dimples, and then this is ready to go to the duplicator, before you buy your wood, is you want to do some research. These gun stocks need to be cut ready. And what I mean by that is roughly you're going to see you want 9 to 10% moisture content. Now what they'll do on these is they'll plug these off with, or they'll cover these off with wax so that the moisture doesn't come in here, depending on where you're at in the country. Very important though, for a number of reasons. First of all, if your moisture content, if this isn't cut ready, if you've just gone, you fell a tree, black walnut, and you're ready to go cut, not so. You'll spend a lot of time on that piece of wood if it's not been stabilized, and that's what the moisture content doing. It needs to be stabilized, and there's a variety of different ways you can research and find out how to stabilize the wood, but the wood needs to be stabilized. That prevents the wood from shrinking and or warping. Calico woods, they have all their woods are already ready cut. So be sure when you buy a piece of wood it's ready cut. If they're not telling you the moisture content, you need to keep walking. It's really at your own risk at that point. Unless it's a piece of mesquite and you got it for 30 bucks, it's leaning up against the barn, you're ready to go play with it, go ahead. The other thing that you want to do is just take a look. The different figurations of the wood have to do with also how it's been cut. Many conversations around the configuration of the wood, but there's several different ways they can quarter sawn, hew sawn. There's different ways that they'll cut the wood, and it's something else you want to research. Ask your wood supplier how they're cutting their woods. They'll tell you. If they're giving you some advice on the layout of this gun, I would follow their advice. Like I said, I've been using Calico woods, and I have never gotten a bad piece of wood. When you do cut them sometimes, you'll find that there'll be holes in the wood, and what I'll do there is I'll fill that in with epoxy, black epoxy, and it actually adds, when you're finished with it, it adds to it. Now obviously if you've got problems here in the grip area when you cut this out, those are a little bit more tedious. And the other thing I like about Calico hardwoods is that those folks stand behind their wood. I've never returned a piece of wood. When you're working with your wood supplier, is who they are and are they going to stand behind the wood. All right, so this piece of woods, I need to dimple it, and this for where I'm going to put it on the holder, and I'll just make sure that I've got alignment of wood, and then I'll double check this in the duplicator. But at this point, this piece of wood's ready to go to the duplicator.